Hi everyone, my name is Stacey and welcome to Sewing with Stacey Lee. I'm so excited about my new series where I'm going to teach beginners how to sew. Now I know sewing can be a bit daunting and some people have no idea where to start. So if that's you, this is where you start. I'm going to take you through step by step all the instructions you need to become a competent sewer. But the first thing we need to do is make sure you've got all the tools you need to get started. So the first thing you're going to need is a sewing machine. Now if you've already got one, great, let's use that. If you don't have one, I suggest you try and borrow one. Perhaps you've got a family member or a friend who has one that will let you borrow it. Or if you can't find one, maybe you could put a little post on Facebook asking if there's anyone you know that has one you could borrow. But if you really must buy one, I'm going to give you a few tips on what I recommend. So I recommend you stick with a well-known brand when you're choosing a sewing machine. I personally have used Brother, Janome and Benina, and I've been happy with all of those brands. There are other fantastic brands as well, but just make sure it's a well-known brand. Also, the price point really does need to be over $100 because in my experience, anything under $100 is generally more of a toy than an actual sewing machine. And trust me, we want to be learning on a sewing machine, so just spend that little bit extra money. You might want to look at second-hand, but just bear in mind a second-hand sewing machine might have been sitting around for a long time and probably needs a service, so you'll need to factor that into the cost. So a few features that I really like and you might want to take them into consideration when you're choosing your sewing machine is speed control. And that's this button here. It basically means I can choose how fast or how slow I want to sew. And that is a fantastic feature for someone learning to sew. My second favorite feature is the needle down position, and that's this button here. And when I turn that on, that means that whenever I stop, my needle will be down. And that is fantastic for whenever we're trying to turn or pivot, or perhaps we need to check something, and it means that our sewing isn't moving around while we're doing that because the needle is in the down position holding it in place. And I love that feature. Something else you could look for is the one-step buttonhole feature, which is also fantastic to have. And I also like the free arm feature, especially if you're planning to sew clothes in the future. Basically, this piece can come off, which means we can sew tubular items on here, say perhaps a sleeve, and that's a really handy feature to have, like I said, if you want to learn to make clothes in the future. One last thing I want to mention is the stitches. We only need our sewing machine to do a really nice straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. We only need 2 stitches. We don't need hundreds and hundreds of stitches. We need a straight stitch and a zigzag. So when it comes time to choosing your sewing machine, please don't get too hung up. We just need a sewing machine. Work out your budget, make sure it's a well-known brand, and I'm sure it will be fine. So the next thing we'll need is cutting tools, and there's 2 ways of cutting fabric, with shears, dressmaking shears that is, or with a rotary cutter. Now I'll start with talking about the rotary cutter. I love the Alpha rotary cutter, and if you're left-handed you can change the blade over to cut on the other side. You'll also need with a rotary cutter a ruler. I like the largest one you can buy. It's 24 by 6 inches, but it basically means you'll only need the one ruler. I also like the largest Alpha mat that you can buy, and this is 24 by 36 inches. The 3 tools all work together, so one doesn't work without the other. You will need to buy all 3 tools. So all this information will be on my website, so you can refer back to it to find out everything you need. So now let's talk about dressmaking shears. These are fantastic, and if we were making a pattern with paper and then cutting our fabric out with them, this is what you would use. Particularly useful if you're making clothing. And I like extra long ones because you'll get a much longer, straighter cut, preferably at least 9.5 inches long. And scissors for sewing are just for fabric. You mustn't ever use them on paper or anything else for that matter because it will blunt them. Something you can do is tie something onto them like a ribbon or some beads so that everyone knows that they're your scissors for sewing. So you'll also need a little pair, which is snips to cut loose threads and smaller things. These are also great to have. And I also have another pair of scissors which is to cut paper and everything else that is not fabric. So you're going to need something to mark your fabric. You could use chalk or a water-soluble pen. I personally prefer chalk. My favorite is this Clover one, and I also like the Fons and Porter chalk pencil. I've also been known to use a standard pencil if I know it can't be seen. So just use whatever you've got on hand or buy whichever one tickles your fancy. You're also going to need a flexible measuring tape, and it's useful if it's got inches on one side and centimetres on the other. You're going to need a seam ripper. Now usually you get a funny little one in a pack you might have bought or with your sewing machine. If you don't have one, I really recommend this Clover one, which is ergonomic and has a larger handle. It's bigger to hold and it's easier to find. That's my favourite seam ripper. I know they're not our favourite tool to have, but they are essential, and I do recommend unpicking those stitches when you really need to. It does make the world of difference. We're going to need pins, and I've got them on my magnetic pin caddy here, and I can't stress enough how this is my favourite tool that I have. I love my magnetic pin caddy because it just sort of attracts the pins, and if you drop them you can get the magnet and kind of swoop them all up. And I've dropped my pins a lot of times, more times than I'd like to remember. As far as pins go, I like these flathead ones because they're easy to pick up and take out when you need to. They're also easy to find if you've dropped them on the floor. And lastly on my table here are bobbins. I recommend you get a few extra bobbins. And what I like to do is I use a lot of white thread, so I wind maybe 3 or 4 bobbins at a time. I put them in a Ziploc bag and I label it that I know that this is my Aurifil thread with my Aurifil bobbins. Now with bobbins, I don't recommend buying a generic brand. I really recommend you buy the brand you need for your sewing machine, because bobbins can give you a lot of trouble with your tension and not sewing correctly. So make sure you're using the right bobbins. And like I said, pop them in a Ziploc bag with your thread and then you're always good to go. So the last 2 items you're going to need is an iron and an ironing board. Every good sewer presses every seam after they've sewn it, and it gives you a really nice tidy finish. If you already have an iron, it's going to be absolutely perfect. If you don't, just buy one within your budget. Honestly, a $20 iron from Target is going to be absolutely fine. And with that, I'm going to leave you. All the details are in my description below. You can find this list on my website, and I can't wait to see you next time, where we'll start sewing by learning to thread a sewing machine, and then we'll practice sewing a straight line. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.